And I'm delighted to welcome Professor Nigel Wood, who has kindly offered to do the first presentation of our 2022 virtual Anthony Powell Society conference. So thank you very much, Nigel, for that. Some of you may recall that Nigel presented at our last conference, the one in Oxford, at the beginning of September 2018, that time ago, on Powell's modernism. Nigel has a broad range of interests from Shakespeare, including productions of Shakespeare, 18th century literature, as well as modern authors. Nigel's topic is Powell and Grub Street. So I'll hand over to Nigel and I'll attempt to help Nigel by screen sharing. Nigel, over to you.
Okay. Yes, what I want eventually will be the PowerPoint slides up in so that we can all see them and I can speak to them. Just one preparatory thing. Thanks, that's great. Just one preparatory thing, and that's a belated thanks to Jeff Manley, who I believe is here, who, with his wife, looked after me grandly when I was visiting Austin in Texas. And I was glad to hear your name, Jeff, and glad to see that you're surviving. I'll get in touch with you outside this sort of formal arrangement. Well, one of the things that I'm going to try and address is something rather dear to my heart, and it is a link with the 18th century for me. On one level, the 18th century saw the perhaps notorious birth of the book trade near to how we would understand it up until the digital incursion or the digital revolution. And the 18th century, shall we say from 1710 onwards, with the first of the more formal Copyright Acts, was a way of understanding and individualizing the author. Now, Powell understood very well what the consequences of such individuation might have been. And so I've called this lecture Powell and Grub Street because it's a segue into a look at the circumstances of, well, his first job after leaving Oxford, which was, of course, at Duckworth's, the publishers, and his reaction to how the publishing world appeared to him, and indeed in which he was deeply engrossed from 1926 up to about 1932. Powell himself is rather reticent, actually, in Keep the Ball Rolling about quite why, I think it was just exhaustion, he left Duckworth's, but he did testify in volume 2 of his memoirs how enfranchising it appeared. So let's move on. And Paul, could you just give me the next slide, please? Is that possible? There we are. Thanks. Ah, yes, one back. It's really just Johnson's entry in the dictionary of what Grub Street meant to him and how it took on a figurative status as well as a geographical one. And notice it's not great literature that is signified by Grub Street. The creators of small histories, dictionaries, and temporary poems were the products of Grub Street. And the next slide, please. Yeah, just a little further context. It does not any longer exist except figuratively. It was renamed Milton Street in 1830, but it became the locus, confluence point of a great deal of almost an explosion of publishing activity. And it comes at a point in the 18th century where the printed word suddenly became democratized. It became available, as the cost of paper helped, of course, it became available so that what had hitherto been a distinction between the learned patron selecting the authors that were to be commemorated for posterity, suddenly, as long as you could afford it, books abounded. And that distinction between the books that should survive and the books that did survive became something of a crisis point for writers like Pope, Swift, definitely, who saw literary value under some kind of threat. Yes, Paul, could we have the next slide, please? And this is its actual, as of the middle of the 18th century, its actual existence. And if you could see Grub Street in the center of this slide, running through a series of small alleyways, small workshops, and up towards more fields. It was a very, it was a rabbit warren of different kinds of activity, but the publishing world flocked there. Any new production was often seen wet off the press, damp off the press, before it was taken along to St. Paul's Churchyard or other places where it became more formally displayed in front of booksellers' stalls. Now, next slide, please, Paul. Now, it will be probably better known to all of you as the subject of Alexander Pope's mock epic, The Dunciad, and especially the later versions of Pope's work of 1743, of The Dunciad. I won't read it all, but I'll read the bits I want to concentrate on, and I think are very often overlooked. Think about the poet's form that is the object of this scurrying by booksellers and others in order to capture the poet, the essence of the poet. It's unsuccessful. The poet dissolves before one's eyes, and indeed these authors or stationers, by an impulsive gravity of head, as Pope puts it, enter a field of glory that is a field for all. And it's really a crisis of authorial identity at the same time. Next slide, please. Now, as an intermediary up to Anthony Powell, although he's well capable of being able to ingest and honor Pope for himself, there is something that I think is important about this intermediary voice, and that is George Gissing's New Grub Street, 1891. Gissing enters and has us enter a netherworld, which is the New Grub Street. It's a world of brothels, it's pop-up stalls, we would say. It's that world of temporary poets that Pope recalls. And you may know, I don't know whether you are inveterate listeners to Radio 4, but of course, Ed Reardon, 6:30 on an occasional basis, comes over as the curmudgeonly would-be successful writer who is really just set for hire. It's very funny. I would recommend it to you, BBC Sounds, etc. But it is a reference to Gissing, and I'll just read you a little of Jasper Milvain's view of the pursuit of success in the literary world. He knows perfectly all the possible sources of income. Whatever he has to sell, he'll get payment for it from all sorts of various quarters. None of your unpractical selling for a lump sum to a middleman who will make 6 distinct profits. Now look you, if I had been in Reardon's place, I'd have made 400 at least out of The Optimist. I should have gone shrewdly to work with magazines and newspapers and foreign publishers and all sorts of people, Reardon can't do that kind of thing. He's behind his age. He sells a manuscript as if he lived in Sam Johnson's Grub Street. So you're not a vocational novelist, or generically speaking, a writer of tragedies or comedies. You're not even, solely speaking, a journalist. You are a writer for hire. You have a kind of portmanteau existence whereby whatever you put your mind to, it has to have a cash value attached. I remember when I was at Birmingham University, which I was there for about 13 years, I coincided with David Lodge, and in fact worked with David on a number of different ventures. And David wore his celebrity extremely lightly. As a novelist, he was well known to be able to keep to publishers' deadlines. He understood the difficulties publishers had of being able to arrange publication lists, etc. And he was extremely caring about that. And what David was remarkable for was the ability to be able to sport his oak, squirrel himself away in his academic office, and in fact write. And the tacit instruction down the corridor, I shared an office next door, was that he was not to be disturbed when the door was closed. And what David frequently said, not just to me but to others, was that it was very, very difficult for a novelist with an agent in tow and a favoured publisher to disappoint or to celebrate in changing one's style. One got imprisoned in what he called the second novel syndrome. The difficulty of being able to come up with something that was truly revolutionary or disturbed one's own carefully constructed first novel persona. And this was the fate of the cash nexus that surrounds literary creation, the difficulties of being able to escape the kind of character that you created for yourself, and indeed the style that you had initially got to be known for. And I'm sort of fascinated in this on one level, because with the few people I know who are Powell aficionados, I've tried every now and then to be able to have a discussion about what is characteristic about Powell's style. Certainly in terms of, Dance to the Music of Time, and I would say Venusberg, there is a sense in which one has a sense of what the narrative cycle, the narrative structure consists of. And it is very difficult to pin down, it's the art that hides art, of Powell's ability to be able to capture a form of realistic dialogue without it being, as Powell distrusted from the off, the obtrusive style of a modernist like Joyce or Virginia Woolf, where the style betokens the man or woman. The style is the man or woman. With Powell, it's almost as if he's one of these phantom poets that cannot be captured. Next slide, please, Paul. Well, my introduction to Powell's introduction to the publishing world has to start with Duckworth's. Duckworth's, when Powell joined it as almost like a literary odd job man, one could say. He was reviews editor. He also spent quite a bit of time reading manuscripts when he got to the point where he could be trusted. And he understood the difficulties of that interface between a publisher and an author. And this was overseen by George Milstead and George Duckworth. Duckworth himself was a rather patrician individual, rather distant from Powell's point of view, character, indulgent, but someone who had, as it were, had his best days, if you like. He was addicted to a certain kind of fiction, which is usually non-experimental. However, having said that, on the books, Duckworth's, Hilaire Belloc, D.H. Lawrence, Chekhov even, although not access to many of his plays, by the way, Henry James and the early Virginia Woolf. And it's so, although Duckworth was not himself an avid reader and acceptor of modernist classics, it was quite clear that he was open to suggestions about their literary worth. Duckworth would come in of an afternoon. He was an afternoon man, if you like, and Powell realizes that work was to be seen to be done. In fact, Powell shared an office with Duckworth occasionally when his own was being occupied on what we would call a hot desking basis by others. Milstead, however, I could have given you a photograph of Milstead, but it's a very fuzzy one, and I wasn't able to discover a better one, was really just someone out of a betting shop. Check suits, those little betting slips that fitted inside one's felt hat. Milstead took it all as a bit of a lark, and he was the one who could take a dart at a new author, and sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't. But the kind of sudden change that helped Duckworth's as an enterprise and certainly had an impact upon Powell himself came a bit later. Could I have the next slide, Paul?
Bear with me, Nigel. I'm just trying to get the next slide. It's refusing.
Sorry, you're doing a lot of the heavy lifting here.
Yeah, I'm trying to move it.
Never mind.
Just go back and then just. It seems to have frozen. It seems to have frozen. Hold on a second.
Mm-hmm.
There we go.
Yeah, that's it. That's good. I have to, before introducing Thomas Balston, I have to apologize. The reproduction I have here came from a temporary exhibition, which is at the Lang in Newcastle. You may, some of you who are Oxford domiciled, may recognize it as on the walls of the Ashmolean in Oxford, and so I will correct that at my leisure. Thomas Balston was as near to a bohemian as Duckworth's would allow. Here he is in a portrait by Mark Gertler, who was his fine art mentor and indeed teacher from 1921. Balston was in many ways a hero to Powell. He had won the Military Cross and was awarded the OBE. He was in his prime and brought in by Duckworth, not Milstead, really to G things up in Duckworth's. He came in actually in 1921 when this portrait was created. And he was a very vigorous figure, somebody who encouraged new talent, somebody who almost wore himself into an early grave, although he didn't die until 1967, but he would have if he'd outstayed his welcome at Duckworth's past 1934. He was somebody who understood that turnover was important, and Powell venerated him for that. He was also, though, and Powell is also ready to recognize this, he's also a figure that's very, very difficult to pin down. He leads by example rather than identifiable character. And when Powell eventually got up the tree and became a major figure at Duckworth's, it was quite clear that this was enabled really by Balston's labours. But Duckworth's was a hand-to-mouth existence as a commercial unit. By no means was it easy going. It was very difficult to maintain copyright or rights to the products that they had first laid their hands to. And so it was a legal battle as well as it was an aesthetic battle to keep the famous names on the list. And there were many misses as well as hits in the list. Okay, could we have the next slide, please? Now, I wouldn't say that Poe was perhaps as addicted as, say, some contemporaries, Evelyn Waugh being an obvious example, where there was a nudge towards roman à clef. I think Poe is very much more difficult to pin down. And although one can trace where some of the characters he rubbed up against did infiltrate his characterizations, it's quite clear that he's very struck by this sense that the successful novelist is very, very amorphous, kaleidoscopic, a jack-o'-lantern. And it's something that evades this sense of an easy personification by a particular kind of style. And as a prelude to talking in the main about books do furnish a room, which I think is a much undersung novel by Poe, I want to dwell a little bit on a 1939 novel, What's Become of Waring. Most of you will have read it and will realize that Waring, there's a doubt about whether Waring exists or whether his much vaunted death, premature death, has actually occurred. The narrator, who is kept characterless, he's just a narrator, and that I think is a telling detail of the novel, is set to track him down and indeed write some kind of account of him. And it's quite clear, the irony is that the elegies and the accounts that come out about Waring are premature. You know, as Mark Twain is famously known to remark, that his death has been much exaggerated. It's very clear that he's escaped the clutches of creditors and that he's gone off to be Waring elsewhere. Well, the reference as the epigraph to the novel points us towards one of, I think, Robert Browning's most successful dramatic lyrics from 1842. And this is the opening of it. The first, I think, two lines are the epigraph of What's Become of Waring. What's become of Waring since he gave us all the slip? Chose land travel or seafaring, boots and chest or staff and scrip, rather than pace up and down any longer London town. It's that escapist dream, if you like, the almost kind of utopian sense that the world of 9-to-5 drudgery, and by that, Poe did include the writing career. You know, you paid your dues to writing by being at your desk early and not leaving it until, you know, you'd done the 1,000 words or whatever. He knew very well, inside out, to my mind, that writing is a trade with all the pitfalls that are attendant upon it. Could we have the next slide, please, Paul? But in Browning's poem, and this is suggested rather than captured by Poe in What's Become of Waring, there is a sense in which there's a kind of melancholy that Browning attaches to Waring. He was prouder than the devil, how he must have cursed our revel. And look at how restless Browning portrays his Waring to be. Up and down he paced this London, with no work done, but great works undone. And this was the devil that sat on the shoulder of the novelist. This desperation at earning the status of a novelist, whilst the secret inside one's heart's core is that one always fails to achieve the utopian state of personal success as a writer. And of course, if you've looked at Dance and the Music of Time, you'll realize that Powell is very good at portraying artistic failures, people who don't attain or continue early promise, or indeed are the victims of this pursuit. And what's become wearing is, I think, the establishing of a kind of hallmark. It's a rather light book in my view. It's not a serious, it's a dry run, I think, for some other figures. And especially two figures I want to spend a bit of time on, which are Books Do Furnish a Room Bagshaw and Xavier Trapnell out of Books Do Furnish a Room. I think they're wonderful comic characters, they're wonderful creations, and they're multifaceted as well. Maybe not Bagshaw, although Bagshaw himself is the creature of anecdotage, the creation of anecdotage. The reason that he gets the name that he does has its successful as well as its nefarious associations. Paul, can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, this is Mark Boxer's in the 225 reprint of Dance. This is Books Do Furnish a Room cover, and this is Xavier Trapnell. He looks forbidding, he looks bohemian. Powell, though, saw him as really a legacy of the 1890s, and he carries, indefatigably, he carries with him a walking stick with a skull carved on its tip. It's almost as if he's not completely Xavier Trapnell without this contraption as a kind of appurtenance. I remember in my 2 terms at drama school before I went to university that, you know, Stanislavski was all the rage. It's going back a while into the 70s. And how you dealt with objects as if they were not detached from your personality, but they were in fact a way of creating the character inside, the interior sense of self, was something that Stanislavski suggested in several of his chapters about creating a character. I'm not saying that Powell read a lot of Stanislavski, he might have, but he arrived at the same conclusion, that Trapnell is hardly ever seen apart from his walking stick. And at the great denouement, where his new novel is cast into the canal in Maida Vale, it's clear that he also, rather like Prospero out of The Tempest, actually tosses this stick into the canal, and a different Trapnell is created thereafter. Next slide, please, Paul. Well, if there is a kind of direct link, it's a bit flimsy, and I would say it is. But in Volume 3 of To Keep the Ball Rolling, Chapter 10, he entitles it New Grub Street. And this is what he has to say most directly. There are indirect references to his life in a publisher's office. Having myself worked in a publisher's office, I know how tiresome authors can be, especially when, showing complete disregard for a publisher's carefully worked out, that's a spelling mistake, worked out program, they merely fuss about the precise date on which their own, indeed often bloody boring book is due to appear. Actually, he's reacting there, Powell, I think very wittily, to a dismissal by Graham Greene of his own Aubrey Friends, where the production date of Aubrey and Friends, which Powell had laboured long and hard on, always seemed to get off to vanishing point, and Greene was responsible for trying to give him an accurate date and when it would come out. And he eventually, in a kind of, after a prolongation of a drinking bout, Powell did in fact corner Green, and Green said, well, it will be next year. And anyway, it's bloody boring. So this is Powell, in a sense, referring back to Green's rather hasty opinion. Okay, next slide, please, Paul. Now, you all know, I think, about that visit to the gallery where he saw Poussin's dance to the music of time, and suddenly there was a sense in which it came upon him, the Wallace collection, it came upon him exactly how a multi-volume project could come together. And this is the point as recorded in Keep the Ball Rolling. I won't detain you with reading it all, but I'll give you a sense of what Powell said. On reading and rereading the works of even the greatest novelists, one is apt sooner or later to become aware of what seems in effect the same character reappearing under a different name, the same situation cropping up in another setting. The menace of repetition is common to all, particularly for runners in the 80,000 word stakes. There again, you know, you're lucky if you're allowed to be a Tolstoy or a Goldsworthy and exceed the 80,000 word limit. That's a trade limit, not a talent limit or an aesthetic limit. And it crops up again and again. You have to understand the limits that any author is working under. But notice repetition, and yet at the same time, he is concerning himself with thinking about how to write a multi-volume testament to how time moves forward and gets entangled with character. And it's a really daring, and he's self-aware about it, a very daring project, because he's well aware at the start that one has to escape the snares of repetition. And it's, having taught some creative writing at a university, I realize, you know, the second novel syndrome is a particularly difficult pitfall to avoid. It's relatively easy to become typified in some ways when all your energies in your first novel and the first novel's success crowd in upon you. Agents, publishers expect there to be more of the same. And yet, Powell understood that the technical difficulty was to try and escape that typification. Paul, could I have the next slide, please? And it's a technical matter that Powell is after. I'm not saying that one simply appreciates Powell because of, how can I put it, because he's a technician, but he understands that aiming for publication needs a kind of discipline from without. And that, I think, is important. And it's also important that that kind of discipline Xavier Trapnell does not appreciate. Next slide, please. Thanks, Paul. And I put a few questions, which, I don't know, may feed into questions from you. But there are technical challenges which I think are important to realize. How much of the self would be authentic in a fiction? The self and authenticity is always a punt in the dark, isn't it? And in a volume format, how might one avoid repetition and ensure narrative extension? And there is a trap in autobiography, and this becomes clear in Aubrey and Friends. This is Powell. Aubrey was incapable of running his personal affairs in a coherent manner. His essentially new approach was vested in the manner in which he looked at things with an unprejudiced eye. Very difficult, I think, to attain that. An instinct for what his contemporaries or historical figures were like as individuals, his mastery of the ideal phrase for describing people. Surely, I think, a bit of Aubrey rubs off on Powell, or rather, Powell's way of reading Aubrey brings those kinds of things together. Next slide, please, Paul. Thanks. And Waring doesn't appear in What's Become of Waring. He's a travel writer, notice, which I think is an important detail. And his physical reality is never apparent. The public like Waring because he's consumerist in a sense. If you like, he's on the spectrum. He's on the spectrum as light entertainment, if you like. And it's also, of course, notice a trap that those addicted to popular journalism are too apt to fall into. One goes back to Pope, one goes back to Gissing and sees the link. Next slide, please, Paul. And there is a report of his death, which is just wrong. And that there's a lot of glee at the way that the elegies give his age completely wrong. It was reported that he died in Sanary, south of France, but that could not have been a possible location, etc. Okay, next slide, please, Paul. And there is a kind of posthumous T.T. Waring, just as there is a posthumous Xavier Trapnell. If you remember in Hearing Secret Harmonies, there is the Donner's Prize, which is awarded to the rather dogged American critic called Gwinnett. And Powell gets us to realize that, in fact, there is a distinction between the kind of academic research truth and the truth that is living and breathing, or indeed is notional in the case of Waring. Next slide, please. Well, books do furnish a room is the epithet that's given to Lindsay Bagshaw, who's a left-wing literary figure. He edits Fission, striking the right note for the atomic age. I think we think of it now as for the digital age. And Bagshaw is so facile in being able to write. He possessed that opportune facility for turning out several thousand words on any subject whatsoever at the shortest possible notice. And one of the possible reasons for that epithet attaching himself to Bagshaw, I've captured here. When this large glass-fronted bookcase falls on him, he was heard to say, "Books do furnish a room." The less savoury anecdote is that he is in flagranti with the wife of a publisher friend, and the publisher friend's wife admires his room, and Bagshaw utters, "Books do furnish a room" at the end of it. Again, a bifurcation. You choose which of these two anecdotes, or both, are truer of the character concerned. Next screen, please, Paul. Well, Trapnell is an enigma. Nick Jenkins expects for him to be a ferocious critic, the kind of person who gains gravity by attacking other people. And his one great success is this camel ride to the tomb, bearing all the marks of having been written by a man who found difficulty in getting on with the rest of the world. And yet, the fascinating thing to me is that Powell does give to Trapnell, who after all is a failure, some very apposite remarks on naturalism, and indeed how you select and represent the realistic in a work of fiction. Does one venerate facts, which are inevitably selective? And the business of being a writer is not one where you wait for inspiration to strike. However, Trapnell is inordinately keen on being a writer, and that's probably part of his tragedy. Next slide, please.
And eventually he's a tradesman. Trapnell's attitude is nearer that of a businessman or a scientist, never tired of discussing his job from a professional angle. He's always acting a part. He's very, very difficult to pin down. And the contraries that are met in Trapnell are what fascinates Powell. Not just Trapnell, but a lot of characterization. It's that attraction of opposites, that dichotomy, if you like. Even assuming relative clarity at the outset, the role sustainer is fascinating sometimes because the surface belies the interior individual. Yes, next slide, please, Paul. And this is Trapnell, who doesn't like naturalism and distrusts it as a heresy. A novelist is like a fortune teller who can impart certain information, but not necessarily what the reader wants to hear and does not expect to hear, right? But naturalism is only like life. If the novelist himself is any good, it doesn't matter whether he writes naturalistically or any other way. The sphere of authenticity lies elsewhere, not on how lifelike you can portray the outside world, but how you escape the foresight of the reader or the predictions of a reader. And that, to me, is the fascinating thing about Powell. Okay, last, I think it's going to be the last slide. Writing as a craft. Now, I don't see this as necessarily being a black mark against any writer. And there are, again, certain things that are posed by this concentration on the book trade and Powell's part within it. How can an author have a personality? How can we say it's authentic? In what sphere or context does it become authentic? If the style is instantly recognizable, is this valuable? Or is it just simply an elephant trap that an author falls into? Is action a result of character, as with the Poussin example? Or is it this rather tacit dance in which the individuals are unconsciously imbricated? How new was Powell's Grub Street, and how can we discern the professional writer? And well before 1971, and books do furnish a room, there is this quote which stays with me from a buyer's market. Again, drawing on mercantilism to a degree. For reasons not always at the time explicable, there are specific occasions when events begin suddenly to take on a significance previously unsuspected, so that before we know where we are, life seems to have begun in earnest at last, and we ourselves, scarcely aware that any change has taken place, are careering uncontrollably down the slippery avenues of eternity. Where does consciousness or the truth lie? Who has grasp of it? Is something that I think when we read Powell, we marvel at the fact that there isn't the presiding deity who tells us what we should think. Okay, thanks very much. I'll draw it to a close at this point.
Great. Thank you very much, Nigel. I found that very interesting and thought-provoking. Questions from anybody? Christopher's got his hand up. If you can unmute.
Yeah, unmute. There we are. Thank you. Yeah, very interesting indeed. Thank you very much, Nigel. I wanted to ask if you felt there was any sense in which some of Trapnell's own kind of pronouncements on the art of fiction were actually Powell's own manifesto. I'm thinking of there's a passage I sort of referring to from memory where he talks about the difference between the novelist and the biographer or historian.
Yes, that's right.
Are by definition giving a partial story, whereas the novelist is creating the entire character. And I have to say, I finished my, umpteenth read through Dance at Christmas, and I read that.
Oh, right. Okay.
And obviously McLaren Ross is commonly thought to be the model for Trapnell. And
Yes,
I
yes.
read, it was an absolute brilliant novel. I read it at 2 sittings, and there's a lot of stylistic pointers in it towards the later Powell, it seems to me, and it also seemed to me towards Kingsley Amis. But anyway, anybody who hasn't read this, it's definitely a sort of ancillary.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. Yeah.
But anyway, the manifesto, I thought, was an interesting point. Do you think it's a manifesto?
I don't think Powell is constitutionally given to manifestos because that's a straitjacket. I think that there are certain beliefs that are gained from experience, not a priori, but post facto, about what the experience of writing a novel is. And I think you look through Keep the Ball Rolling for a section, and I haven't discovered it yet, where you find, Powell finally coming up with some kind of grounding in, some kind of theory on which his approach to writing is based. It reminds me to that degree of sifting through Jane Austen's letters. And Jane Austen's letters are wonderful in terms of anecdotage, rubbing up against some interesting people down a Regency Street. And Powell tends to be a bit like that. The parties he's attended, the people, the ludicrous qualities of some of the people he meets outside of his study. And I think very often with Powell, sometimes the narrative moves, and then it's the point where it doesn't move that your attention is concentrated upon. And I do think that Trapnell enjoys 2 or 3 occasions when we have to stop, right? Stop and stare. And it's the nearest I've got to a kind of guide of how Powell regarded fiction. He was very distrustful of naturalism, we know that. But it's put into quite persuasive words, I think, by Trapnell. So I think, Christopher, I think yes, but he would be averse to its being, a manifesto, because I think that is generically something that he wants to avoid.
So let's just be quiet. Thank you very much, Nigel.
Yeah.
Hey, anybody else? Any more questions? If anybody's waving or whatever, I can't see you. So let me just flick over to the other screen.
Chris, yeah.
Okay, Chris Burns has got his hand up. Chris, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nigel. Very interesting, especially from the standpoint of the fact that 1 year ago today, I had never heard of Anthony Powell.
Oh.
But thanks to an amazing class sponsored by the Rosenbach Library in Philadelphia, I took an online class hosted by Mr. Wesley Stace, where we have read for the last 12 months an individual volume of Powell's work.
Yeah.
And it has been fantastic.
Yeah.
To the point that I have obviously joined the Powell Society.
Yeah.
And I have read Hilary Sperling's biography. And my next stop is What's Become of Waring, which I just purchased.
All right.
It's amazing. It's just an incredible world.
Very Powellian.
Quite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's great to come to Powell late. I used to have a tutor when at university who says you must always reserve something for the evening of life. And I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
I mean, I held back from actually trying to read all that I should of Dickens. And I'm almost glad I did, because now I'm on to Dombey and Son at the moment, which is a doorstop of a book. If you
Well, that's
remember.
very interesting because prior to the Powell class, the Rosenbach offered a Dickens class where we read David Copperfield, and that's where I was in. And I was a big Dickens fan from the get-go. But I'm telling you, these classes that the Rosenbach sponsor, and Wesley Stace is leading the class, just terrific.
Yeah. Well, I returned to Powell, actually. I read him as an undergraduate, not because I was forced to in the academic treadmill, but because I just couldn't put him down. I read it in sequence, of course, you're supposed to. Read Venusberg. And it's only later that I've returned, and of course it's a different novel. It isn't a different novel, but it is, because I'm different. And so I come to it and I suddenly feel that I'm seeing things that, occasionally, but only occasionally, I get reported from one of my books as Wood says. And what Wood said is sort of from the 1980s or early 1990s. And all I have to say is Wood wouldn't say that now. It's not me any longer. Sorry, it's once the case, but not now. And I think rediscovering is almost as good as encountering for the first time. Actually, I must admit.
Jeff, you had your hand up just now.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi, and thank you very much for that talk, Nigel. As you were talking, I tried to think if Powell ever ran into a period like is described in the novel by Gissing, where he was, living hand to mouth and needed something desperately to get published. It would, I guess, have been either just before or just after the war that might have happened. Because other times he always had some other job,
That's true.
Fall back on if things dried up. And there was always the Bank of Dad if that didn't work. But do you think there's anything that he wrote in any of his novels that might have described, a period where that kind of pressure was affecting what he might have been doing?
I think it's implicit, because I think that the financial nexus, much beloved of a Marxist, for example, you find it very difficult at how, say, at Lady Molly's or in the acceptance world, how he gets and affords to be able to travel to the party, or indeed how he makes a living so that he can hold his head up sartorially at a party, is not really the concern of Powell as a novelist. In reality, if you look, as I've just done, in fact, at book 2 of Keep the Ball Rolling, you realize that he's extremely conscious of the fact that the Bank of Dad only accounted for half his allowance, and the pittance he got from Duckworth's accounted for the rest. And Powell, not inveterately, but a couple of times, basically does his own counting house accounts of how he's going to manage, And where he lived, which is just a walking distance from Covent Garden itself, is the most unsavory, yet, the acme of bohemianism. Brothels, scuffles in the street, and they're recounted in some detail. He recounts in some detail a prostitute laid out in front of his door and others going round and ignoring her as well. So he's drawn to that texture of poverty, I suppose. And it crops up later on, I think, very often with Trapnell, that seedy existence, when basically Pamela Fitton runs away with him, and Nick Jenkins visits him in Books Do Furnish a Room, and you're hit with the stench of impoverishment, and I think there and then he's not going to make it to the second novel. You get that sense at that point. So I think it's largely implicit, Jeff, but I think that's not to say it's not there. I think it crops up in that quiet on the shoulder way in his writing, actually.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Anybody? No? Nobody? Okay. One thing that occurred to me, Nigel, was the second piece of Browning that you put up. How much resonance there was with Powell's Caledonia.
Ah, yes.
It almost felt, as if it was a piece of the same work.
Yes, exactly. I mean, he's very good. Caledonia is a case in point of traveling, but not being where you've traveled to. I don't think I can put it any better than that, but I can try. In that, it's the difference between seeing the world through a Fuji camera or your iPhone.
Yeah.
You're there and you're traveling through it, but you're not completely registering it, or you're not seen to be registering it in the deep way that perhaps we would when we're going somewhere on a bucket list. Yes, I'll look at that, Keith, because I think that there is another symbiosis there. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, and any more questions, or have we done? Okay, Nigel, thank you very much for that. Just a quick admin clear up from me, just to remind you that the next talk in this series is in a month's time, Wednesday the 16th of February, same time. Nick Burns will be talking to us on AP and childhood, which again should be an extremely interesting interlude. Paul, would you like to sort of wrap up?
Yes, just to say thank you to everybody for joining this this first presentation of our virtual conference this year. Thanks, of course, to Nigel for such a stimulating talk, well presented. I do have talks lined up for at least March, April and May. So we're intending to have one a month, probably skipping August as the holiday month. So please watch out for further information on that. And can I just, two other things really. One is any ideas about how we might improve these presentations, thoughts about running these Zoom webcasts, please email me at secretary@anthonypowell.org. And last but not least, thanks to Keith for hosting and managing all the logistics.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
So,
no problem.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Have a great rest of the day and hope to see you in February.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.